Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture will cover elections from 1976 to 1984, covering the Carter and Reagan years. I left off the previous lecture with this slide showing poor economic conditions under the short presidency of Gerald Ford on the two graphs, one showing inflation and the other and showing unemployment. I've highlighted the Ford years. You could see a major spike in both inflation and unemployment, so-called stagflation, which was at the time, unusual phenomenon. Although you can see that conditions were improving substantially over the course of his presidential tenure. This is setting up for the 1976 presidential election. I'll talk first about the Democratic field. As usual, it's fairly crowded with candidates. Jimmy Carter of Georgia was to win, but he was not expected to at the beginning. He was very much an outsider and relatively unknown. Other candidates included George Wallace of Alabama, representing the far right wing of the Democratic Party. A number of people on the left to varying degrees, from Jerry Brown of California, Frank Church of Idaho. Henry Jackson of Washington represented what today would be called the neoconservative wing of the Democratic Party in favor of the New Deal style social programs, but also quite in favor of military spending and relatively harsh attitude towards the Soviet Union. At any rate, Carter came out sort of out of nowhere and did very well in the primaries. You can see on the map here, Carter in the pink color winning most of the primaries in the South, not surprisingly. Wallace took Mississippi and Alabama, but also many Midwestern states, Mid-Atlantic states, New England states as well. An interesting pattern anyway. Also, you can see Jerry Brown taking California and Nevada. Carter's had several advantages after the Watergate scandal and the before that, the 1972 Republican landslide. He was an outsider to Washington, and there was a strong desire for that considering Watergate situation. Also a centrist, a moderate reformer, and a Southerner. The Democrats were eager to regain the presidency after that stunning loss in 1972. And a lot of voters thought that a relatively moderate, pragmatic Southern governor would fit the ticket. A lot of those on the left of the Democratic Party, however, were not happy with the possibility of Carter, who was seen as too conservative. So an anybody but Carter movement arose, particularly among Western and Northern liberals, looking to someone like Jerry Brown of California, who, although quite an environmentalist and left on many social issues, was also noted for his financial caution, if you will. Anyway, this was too late, and Carter gets the nomination. Ronald Reagan launched a bid to challenge Gerald Ford, the incumbent president, for the Republican nomination. As I explained in the previous lecture, Reagan represented what is often known as the fusionist wing of the Republican Party, a relatively new wing, usually linked to William Buckley and the National Review, which came up with a sort of new, harder-edged version of conservatism in the Cold War period. The three legs of this fusionist wing were a stern anti-communist attitude and support for a strong military, a relatively libertarian or laissez-faire policy towards on economic issues, with the government retreating from economic decision-making, and cultural conservatism. That was a big challenge to the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, which was relatively moderate, especially on social and cultural issues. At any rate, you can see a very clear pattern on the map showing the primaries and caucuses of the Republican Party in this year, with Reagan doing extremely well in the West, in the South, and parts of the Midwest, especially the western part of the Midwest, into the Great Plains region. And Gerald Ford, the more establishment-oriented candidate, doing very well in New England, Mid-Atlantic states, most of the old Midwest, and taking Florida as well. So the two candidates are going to be the incumbent Ford, who came in as vice president after Richard Nixon resigned, and Jimmy Carter. Reagan is going to have to wait 4 more years. Ford was doing pretty well in the polls. As I mentioned before, the economy was in a pretty rough spot, but conditions were improving. But he made a major blunder. Some observers claim the biggest blunder in U.S. presidential debate history, where he said, and to quote, "There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration. And secondly, I do not believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union." Well, of course, Poland was dominated by the Soviet Union, as was the entire Warsaw Pact zone. Soviet Union made this very clear in 1956 and 1968 in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, respectively, when they sent tanks in to take power after popular movements for more open government. So it's really just a staggeringly ignorant claim, and really sort of difficult to imagine where it came from, especially from someone in Ford's position. In the election in November, it turned out to be relatively close. Well, the gap in the popular vote very similar to that of 2024, with Carter getting a majority of the votes, but just barely 50.1%, and Ford with 48. The Electoral College was close as well, 297 to 240. Wouldn't have taken many states to have flipped that election. The geographical pattern is intriguing, with the West and the Great Plains states almost all going for Ford. So the Republicans really swept the West. I talked about this pattern in the previous lecture, noting that this is not reflected in Congress. It was this East-West division. Anyway, Ford picked up a number of Midwestern states, including very important ones like Illinois and Michigan, and took northern New England and Connecticut as well, New Jersey and Virginia, but Carter took the rest. It's interesting that another election in which there's not a strong regional divide outside of that East-West pattern, at least in the eastern half of the country. Not surprisingly, Carter, being from Georgia, Southerner, took the entire South except Virginia, but also did well in the Mid-Atlantic states, taking states that had become quite strongly Democratic voting, like Massachusetts and New York, as well as Minnesota in the Midwest. It's interesting to look at some of the demographic data here. I've highlighted a few. Not surprisingly, the black vote went very heavily for Carter. Note how heavily the Hispanic vote went as well. In subsequent lectures, I'll talk about the change in the Hispanic or Latino vote in the 2024 election. Pretty evenly split, and actually the male Hispanic vote went for Trump. So quite a change from this earlier period. Ford won the white vote, but just barely. More interesting to me is the gender gap, which is non-existent in this election. As I think I mentioned before, in the 1956 election, there was actually a gender gap, slight gender gap, of women voters in favor of Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican candidate. Today, the gender gap is quite substantial, and it's definitely women voters more inclined towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So I'll sort of track out that change in gender voting patterns over the next few lectures. As far as religion, not surprising that Ford took the Protestant vote and Carter took the Catholic vote and the Jewish vote quite heavily. And we have the sort of New Deal pattern that emerged in the 30s and maintained in place up to this point of the Republican candidate, taking the professional managerial class quite substantially and the blue collar class going quite heavily for the Democrats for Carter. And this similarly with education, with the higher level of Democratic votes with lower rates of educational attainment and college graduates going for Gerald Ford by some 12 percentage points. On the county level map, we can see Carter successfully reclaiming the South. Every single county in Georgia, his home state, he was quite popular there. You can see just overwhelming support in Arkansas, Tennessee, except the traditionally Republican voting counties in the far east of Tennessee. A little further north, West Virginia, with its coal mining dependent economy and high rates of unionization, very heavy votes for the Democrat Carter. And then you could see Minnesota in the north central part of the country, a strong Democratic bulwark for quite some time, with the exception of some of the southern farming counties. That area in the northeast, very heavily blue. A lot of that is mining territory. The Mesabi Iron Range is in that zone. City of Duluth, port city, shipping out iron ore. A long heritage of labor activism and support for the Democratic Party. Interesting to see, though, also a lot of counties in South Dakota, North Dakota still voting for the Republican candidate. New York, although New York State went for Carter, is largely because of New York City. You can see most of the counties are red, and many of them quite heavily red. We'll look at these county level patterns in subsequent elections as well. Congress was almost unchanged in this election. You can see Republicans gained one Senate seat, but Democrats gained one House seat, so really not much difference. It is interesting in the Senate, though, how the Republicans made really strong gains in the West, including California. That's going to come to an end before too long. The accomplishments of the Carter administration, many of these were on the left side of the political spectrum, you could say, from the arms control SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union, the Panama Canal treaties returning the Panama Canal zone, which was controlled by the United States, to Panama. This is something that conservatives especially disliked and campaigned against. Camp David Accords, a step towards peace in the Middle East. Food stamps expanded, Superfund for toxic waste. Department of Education was established. Department of Energy was established. I put in red airline deregulation because it's something more commonly associated with conservative political leaders. There was actually quite a bit of deregulation in the Carter administration, particularly in really sort of key aspects of the economy like airlines. And it did usher in a period of much reduced airline fares. Low budget carriers start to emerge, and air transportation becomes more a mass phenomenon than it had previously. As happened under Gerald Ford, stagflation, meaning inflation and unemployment, really bedeviled Carter and the Carter administration. And you could see on those graphs where I have highlighted the Carter years, unemployment at first dropping but then rising again, and inflation, especially the second half of his term in office, really increasing. A lot of this had to do with energy costs. We can see this in graph showing price of gasoline. You could see it increasing in 1973. That's under Ford, with the Arab oil embargo that happened after the 1973 war, pitting Israel against several of its neighbors. And then in 1979 came the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iran-Iraq War after that, resulting in a even much larger surge in gasoline prices, which then sort of ramified through the economy as energy prices went up, leading to a lot of the inflation that was experienced during this time. Carter administration had a pretty strong energy policy. One was to increase production, but domestic production of oil, natural gas in the United States, but more of a focus on conservation and renewables, fitting the sort of environmentalist tenor of the time. So Jimmy Carter really pushed energy conservation. You could see he's said it's not just common sense, it's patriotism, put solar arrays up on the White House, which Ronald Reagan later took down. The United States also instituted a 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit. This had always been the province of the states, and some states, especially western states, had some quite high speed limits. When I was a child, Nevada had no speed limit at all outside of towns. I don't know when that changed, but under Carter, 55 across the country. Quite interesting to compare that to today. Many western states have speed limits on the interstates up to 80 miles an hour. And if you're driving 80 and then slow down to 55, well, it feels like you're crawling. This was something that had quite a bit of support at first, but certainly frustrated many drivers. With these sorts of issues going on, it's no surprise that the Democrats had some substantial losses in Congress, losing in 1978 midterm elections. Democrats lost 15 seats in the House and 3 seats in the Senate. But notice a couple things to note about this. One is the House is still overwhelmingly controlled by the Democratic Party, 277 seats to 157. Democrats have a solid lead in the Senate as well, 58 to 41. Although also, you always need to remember that a lot of the Southern members of Congress in the Democratic Party were quite conservative, especially on social and cultural issues. And you can look across the South and just see how blue it is in the House and even in the Senate, although note a Republican pickup in Mississippi and a few definitely other Republican victories in other southern states. But after the midterms, there's continuing setbacks for Carter. I've mentioned before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which resulted in that huge spike in gasoline prices. But equally traumatic was the assault on the U.S. Embassy, the taking of hostages from that embassy who were held in captivity for 444 days. This was something that initially rallied support around Carter, but the longer the hostages were held, the more troublesome it became. And he did launch an effort to free them, but it was a bit of a fiasco. It completely failed, and Carter began to be seen by many as ineffectual. And then in the same year, 1978, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in a very, very brutal assault. Carter did a lot to counter that. Some of the things he did later came back to bite the United States, if you will, supporting Mujahideen or Islamic radical or Islamist fighters against the Soviet Union, many of whom were later to take up arms against the United States. Big question over how effective Carter's policies were. Certainly his critics thought that they weren't. There was really concern about the resurgent Soviet Union and its very aggressive foreign policy, and real fears about what that could lead to. During this period, 1979, Carter gave what has generally been dubbed the Malaise speech, although it wasn't what the speech was actually called. But he called for Americans to sacrifice. They needed collective action to overcome the energy crisis. Also criticized materialism, consumerism, and a loss of faith in government. Carter himself was is still alive, quite a devout Christian, a Baptist. And he argued that the country was facing not just a moral malaise, but a deeply spiritual malaise. This speech was not effective for his own campaign for re-election. It was widely seen as highlighting sort of a detachment or, more important, I suppose, inability to inspire the country. It was not an inspirational speech. It was more of a sermon. At least that's how many people viewed it. So Carter's approval ratings are dropping as the election approaches. You could see, as very common, he began his term in government with very high approval rating, a steady drop. It went up after the Camp David peace accords were established in the Middle East, dropped again, and you can see his crisis of confidence speech. Then the American hostages are taken, and his approval surges. Often an effect when there's a crisis like this for people to rally around the president. But then as the hostages are not released and as the economy goes into recession, it drops again and is down in below, about 33%, which is a worrisome sign. Because of this low approval rating and widespread view that Carter was ineffective, he was challenged from the left in the Democratic primaries by Ted Kennedy, a very well-known senator from Massachusetts, a liberal lion of the Senate, brother of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. As you can see on the map, Kennedy did very well in the more populated states of New England and the mid-Atlantic states, taking Michigan, interesting, North and South Dakota as well, California and Arizona, New Mexico. Carter won primaries and caucuses in all the other states, so was fairly comfortably able to be renominated, but this is not a good sign for an incumbent president to have such a strong challenge from within the president's own party. On the Republican side of things, the fusionist candidate, if you will, Ronald Reagan of California, who was not able to secure the nomination in '76, is able to do so pretty easily in this election. So Reagan was running against George Herbert Walker Bush of Texas, although from a New England family, a very wealthy and politically elite family. George Bush himself moved to Texas when he was a young man to go into the oil business and had a career in politics that was not marked by electoral wins, but was marked by positions within the government, director of the CIA, and so on. But quite a well-known figure, and really represented the more East Coast establishment wing of the party, moderate wing of the party. And John Anderson of Illinois represented the left of the Republican Party, so quite left, as I'll talk about in the next slide. In the primaries and caucuses, you could see that Bush did well in a few states, took a few states, but most went to Reagan. The Republican Party was certainly in a mood now to reject the kind of more moderate establishmentarian policies that characterized Ford, and wanted to return to a fusionist candidate. Barry Goldwater had this very similar positions and was just destroyed in 1964. But Reagan did manage to soften the tone. He said he's not going to get rid of the New Deal programs like Social Security. Assured the electorate that those were not on the table, and moved into the campaign in a pretty strong position. John Anderson is interesting. He's sometimes called the last of the liberal Republicans. So he does not do particularly well in the primaries and decides after Reagan is nominated that he is no longer a Republican, not willing to become a Democrat, instead runs as a left-of-center independent. Very much left-of-center if you look at his policies. Yes, he wanted a fiscal responsibility and a balanced budget, which was usually considered a more conservative or Republican-oriented stance. He also made gestures towards sort of post-partisan politics, emphasizing bipartisan approach. But he really wanted to push renewable energy, wanted a major increase in the gasoline tax for energy conservation, wanted national health insurance, something that Democrats, certainly since Harry Truman and even before, had been advocating quite strongly and had never been able to get through. wanted a more progressive taxation system, in other words, higher taxes on the wealthy, more gender equality, and a reduction in military spending. Well, Reagan was saying we needed a major increase in military spending. So, although from a Republican background, he very much was running as the more as the candidate for in some but not all respects, the candidate farthest to the left. And early polling was quite mixed, and John Anderson was polling quite well, up to 23% in some polls. And no poll did either Reagan or Carter poll at more than 50%. And you could see all the way through August, a number of polls had Carter ahead. But when the election happens in November, it's pretty much a landslide. I wouldn't say a landslide in the popular vote, but Reagan did get a majority, 50.7% to Carter's 41%. Anderson did not do nearly as well as he was polling. Reagan did better than he was polling. Anderson ended up only with 6.6%, but that was still enough to tip a lot of traditionally, or at least recently, Democratic voting states into the Republican camp. For example, New York, Ronald Reagan got 46.66% to Carter's 43.99%, but notice that Anderson was 7.5%. Presumably, if Anderson had not been in the election, many, if not most of his voters would have gone for Carter. Carter probably would have taken New York, Massachusetts, and a number of other states. So the presence of Anderson really did kind of skew the results in the electoral policy. Note Carter taking only Rhode Island, Maryland, District of Columbia, West Virginia, at that point one of the most solidly Democratic voting states. Today it's, along with Wyoming, the most solidly Republican voting state. Carter's own Georgia and Minnesota, which at this time is becoming one of the bulwarks of the Democratic Party. Interesting looking at the county map of the 1980. Blue counties are concentrated in the South. Didn't take every count. Carter didn't take every county in Georgia this time, but he took almost all of them and did quite well in a number of southern states. You can see that Hispanic or Latino zone of South Texas, very, very dark blue. The mostly Hispanic counties of northern New Mexico, quite blue. A few Indian reservations in South Dakota and North Dakota. Mining counties in Montana, where city of Butte and Anaconda are located. Mining counties in far northern Minnesota as well, and the coal mining areas of West Virginia. Otherwise, you have to look really closely for blue counties on the map. Mostly they're urban counties, kind of hard to see, but from Boston to New York City, Philadelphia and Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul. In the far west, it's interesting, Multnomah County. It's kind of hard to see on the map because it's a very narrow county. That's where Portland is. It was certainly blue, but King County in Washington, where Seattle is, notice it's red. Well, it's pink. It's very, very light. Those light pink counties generally mean the Ronald Reagan did not take a majority of the votes. He took a plurality. And again, this is because of Anderson to a very large degree. So if we look at California, only 3 counties went for Jimmy Carter: San Francisco County, Alameda, which is where Oakland is, and Berkeley as well. And then Yolo County in the Central Valley, where the University of California at Davis is. Santa Clara County, associated with Silicon Valley, went for Reagan just barely, but this had one of the highest John Anderson votes at 14%. And then I've just noted a few counties with very high percentage of the votes for Reagan. The most populous by far of the ones I have noted is Orange County in coastal Southern California, which was at this time sometimes considered the most conservative, well, especially conservative in the sense of this fusionist wing of the party that's coming into dominance at this time. The red shift, blue shift map showing changes at the county level from 1976 to 1980 is quite intriguing, is there are two areas of the country that only two that really have this strong blue shift. One is Vermont and upstate New York. Traditionally had been strongly Republican voting, at least most counties there, although Republican in the sense of the more East Coast establishment, moderate, and to some degree liberal side of the party associated with Nelson Rockefeller. I've talked about that. Michigan is somewhat in the same category. And then you can see in Mississippi, central Alabama, a few other counties in the South with a blue shift. Those are counties with large black populations, majority black in many cases. And black voters were not exactly inclined to vote for Ronald Reagan, so there was a bit of a shift here. Just a little bit on the demographic side, I do want to note that Carter won the vote in union households, but just barely. Reagan did a much better among union among union voters than Republicans in previous elections. You can see taking 45% of the vote. And these voters are often described as Reagan Democrats, so many of them were registered Democrats, had been Democratic voting, but were not happy with Carter, who was not particularly a strong union supporter. Plus, a lot of these Reagan Democrats were very upset about the turn in the Democratic Party towards more left-wing or liberal social and cultural positions and environmental positions as well. In this election of 1980, when Reagan does so well, it's no surprise that the Republicans do well in the House election. You could see picking up 34 seats, the Democrats losing 35. But equally important to note just how large the Democratic majority in the House was. Ronald Reagan had to work very closely with the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, to get his legislation package through. So there were a number of compromises made, but by and large, Reagan got much of what he wanted, partly because many of the Democrats, particularly in the South, were quite conservative, at least on many issues. The election map is also interesting to note how well Republican candidates did in the interior portions of the U.S. West, which at this time is moving in a more conservative direction. New Mexico is interesting to note. After this election, the entire House contingent from New Mexico is Republican. In 2024, the entire House representation from New Mexico is Democratic. I'll talk about that in later lectures. Proportionally, even bigger gains for the Republicans in the Senate, gaining 12 seats, Democrats losing, and the Republicans gaining control of the Senate. You can see with 53 to 46 seats. Interesting to note how well Republicans did in the Southeast, a lot of states that were still oriented in Congress towards the Democratic Party, but are now moving away from that, although there's going to be a little bit of back and forth over the next few elections. And Republicans gaining a lot of seats across the northern swath of states as well. One of the things that Reagan had campaigned on very heavily and was best noted for was dropping tax rates, income tax, but other taxes as well, capital gains, estate, corporate taxes. You could see in his first term a major drop and then another drop in top marginal tax rate. I mentioned before how income taxes were dropped under Kennedy and Johnson and then kind of stabilized, and then Reagan dropping them much further. This was part of his what was known as supply side economics. Critics called it trickle-down economics, but the idea of dropping tax rates across the board, but would disproportionately benefit the wealthy and benefit corporations, would result in enhanced economic growth, which would benefit everybody. That was the idea, still highly debated as to how well it worked out in the end. But Reagan combined a big decrease in taxes with increase in defense spending, and in many other areas of spending, kind of keeping the status quo. Remember, he did not want to decrease social spending on things like on social programs nearly as much as Barry Goldwater had wanted. And that was one thing that helped him win the election. But this resulted in a large, you can see the increase in defense spending. It's interesting to look at that graph because you can really see a spike in World War One, and then extraordinarily low defense spending on either side of that before World War One and after, and then a huge spike in World War Two, not surprisingly, and another one after the Korean War. Some ups and downs, but a big increase with Reagan, and then even a bigger increase around 2000 with the so-called War on Terror. This resulted in surging U.S. debt, which went against basic Republican Party principles, which called for a balanced budget if possible and called for being financially conservative. The graph is a little bit hard to read with the red and blue on there, but blue is basically for periods of increasing debt, and U.S. debt is percentage of GDP, not total debt. And again, you can see how important wars were, starting with the Revolutionary War and then the Civil War and World War I and World War II. But you could see under the Reagan era really increasing debt, which increasingly concerning a lot of voters, and many conservative voters as well. With this, when Reagan came into office, inflation was very high with that stagflation under Jimmy Carter, and one of the main things Reagan wanted to do in his early period in office was to wring inflation out of the economy, and that was done by increasing interest rates, a huge increase in interest rates. 30-year fixed mortgages were up to 16-18% in the very first years of the 1980s. And that did indeed reduce inflation significantly, but it also resulted in a major recession, often called the Reagan recession, unemployment going up and a lot of distress in the economic sector. Not surprisingly, this led, and I'm sorry for the title here, that should be 1982, sharp Republican losses in the House election, with Reagan's approval rating, according to Gallup poll, dropping down to 42%. So in the midterm election in 1982, the Democrats gained 26 seats. Republicans lost the same amount. Democrats now have more than 100-seat advantage in the House. Although, again, I always have to caution you, if you look at the South, you see a lot of blue territory there, and many of those members of the House are quite conservative. Despite the severity of the Reagan recession, there was a quick turnaround. You could see real GDP growth rate, and you could see it dropping 1.8% in Reagan's second year in office, but by his 1984 election in November, the economy is booming like it hasn't been since. 7.2% economic GDP growth rate. It had been a long time since the U.S. had such an economic surge. This is a period when the technology industry, computer industry, Silicon Valley are really taking off. Also, there was after coming out of such a severe recession, there's often a rebound, which certainly occurred in this year, which was very helpful. And Reagan really focused on this in his 1984 campaign. It was an optimistic campaign. Probably the most famous ad was "It's Morning Again in America," entering a renewed phase of economic growth, expansion, and optimism, although a lot of concerns about the continuing, in many ways, intensifying Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Democratic parties Democratic primaries and caucuses were quite contentious. A lot of different candidates throwing their hat in the ring. I have photographs of those who withdrew during the primaries and going to the end were Jesse Jackson of Illinois, who didn't really have much of a chance to win the nomination, but was in a good position to get a lot of his platforms into the Democratic National platform. But you can see Jackson taking a couple states, Mississippi and Louisiana, states with very large black populations, about 30% in each state. So Jesse Jackson on the left of the Democratic Party, Gary Hart, a more centrist candidate. I have a slide about him, the next one, and then Walter Mondale, who represented the old guard of the Democratic Party, the New Deal wing from Minnesota, a very staunchly Democratic voting state at this time. If you look at the map, you can see Gary Hart, who styled himself as a New Democrat, more center-leaning. Can you lean to the center? That's an interesting question. But doing very well in the West and the Great Plains states, and doing very well in New England as well. But Mondale doing very well in the South, the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic states, and gaining the nomination. So a few words on Gary Hart's campaign. He was really the first to style himself as a New Democrat, saying the Democrats had to turn leadership over to a new generation, which was more future-oriented, more technologically oriented. So he wanted more technological innovation and investment in education and research, wanted more global economic engagement, even wanted the military to focus more on the technological side of things. Also talked about a balanced budget, a more conservative sort of thing to do, and sort of rejecting New Deal liberalism. So he was a center left and left on many issues, but overall a more centrist orientation than most previous Democratic candidates, at least for some time. Gary Hart is going to run again in 1988, but is going to be derailed by a sexual scandal when it was revealed that he had multiple extramarital affairs, and in particular one on his boat called Monkey Business, which did not go over well at all. In the Democratic debate for the nomination, there were some widely reported moments. Hart claimed that Mondale represented the past and not the future. Mondale responded to Hart's proposals with the quip, "Where's the beef?" This was actually borrowed from a Wendy's hamburger chain advertisement that was well known at the time. But the basic thrust of this criticism is that Hart was talking about a lot of possibilities and a future-oriented campaign, but without the kind of specifics that would help the working class in particular. Put it mildly, Mondale does not do well. Ronald Reagan has a massive landslide. His 1980 election was a bit of a landslide, but this was a real one. You could see the popular vote, something like an 18-point gap. And in terms of the Electoral College, all Mondale took was the District of Columbia and his home state of Minnesota. Mondale was very much hurt by a pledge to raise taxes. He said in a debate with Ronald Reagan, "You'll have to raise taxes because of the deficit, and so will I. At least I'll be honest about it." That did not go over very well, and the Republicans gained 16 House seats and 2 Senate seats, although, the Democrats gained two Senate seats. But the Republicans gained some House seats, but they're still far from a majority in the House. It is important, though, to note the margin of victory. So it might seem quite surprising in retrospect that Massachusetts, for example, went for Reagan, but just barely. You could see it's a very light pink, basically meaning Reagan did not take a majority of votes, but took a very narrow plurality. In some ways more interesting is the relatively dark shading of California. You could see quite a bit darker than either Oregon or Washington. That is going to change, obviously. If we look at the election at the county level, pretty similar to previous ones, although a lot fewer blue counties than we had before. In California, just a handful in the Bay Area. Marin County, a very affluent county north of San Francisco, had been a Republican stronghold, sort of a centrist, a bit of an East Coast Republican annex on the far West Coast, but it has now shifted blue and it's going to remain so. Santa Cruz has shifted as well, major university there, but not many blue counties in California. You can see Southern California pretty dark red, Northern California a pinkish shade, but it's very much a red map. Even Minnesota, which Mondale won, you can see most counties now are red. The far north, tourist-oriented, especially mining and shipping-oriented counties, some dark blue. Minneapolis and St. Paul are blue there as well. Note how New York, upstate New York, which had that very strong blue shift in the previous election of 1990, has shifted back very definitely red, with exception of a couple of counties, one with Buffalo, one with Albany, one with Ithaca and Cornell University. So that's all I have for now. The next lecture will take up the situation in Reagan's second term, and then we'll talk about the 1988 election in which Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, won the Republican nomination and the election. And then the 92 and 96 elections, which are won by Bill Clinton of the Democratic Party. So I hope you can tune in for that election. And thank you for watching.